game where maybe it's not accomplishing what it wants to. Because I feel like because you don't have a sense of like how to choose sometimes, um, you use the only metric you have, which is I want to experience more content, I want to complete missions, and that leads to an attitude of like, how do I click on the right things to get this thing to happen? Like that commenter was posting where it's like, oh, I got all these upgrades, but it didn't pass the event that I wanted it to pass. How come? And I feel like what the game wants to do is to say the universe is very big. There's a lot of things that happen. There's long histories, and they're not easy to define. They're not neat. Um, and there's not like governable like rules. But because we don't really get other reasons to choose these things, I think that the main metric becomes the gamified or the gamification of like wanting to find the right things to hit the game markers, get the mission done, go to the place, accomplish the thing.
Yeah, I agree. I think that I think part of that also might have one of the things I was thinking about, and I'd like to hear what you think about this too. Um, is how much of this is like a way I think about games more and more now, is how much of this is what the game is actually doing, and how much of it is like the tradition of games. Um, and part of the reason I think about it in this way is that like when I'm teaching games, sometimes I'm teaching them to people who don't play games, and they have like a totally different experience with stuff like this. I've never actually played this game with a class, um, a part of me is wondering like, are a lot of the things that I'm expecting the game to do like baggage from other games that I've played, and is not actually like a thing that the game's communicating to me about like goals and things. Um, because the vast majority of like text games and adventure games and space games involve missions that you're trying to solve or whatever. Mass Effect definitely has that. And am I just like the game is like has enough of the markers of that I'm like, oh, this is how this should be working, and it's not working that way, and therefore it sort of confuses me or dissatisfies me. So yeah, I don't know. I would like to hear what you think about like
Yeah.
whether the game is doing that or whether it's like us having played a lot of games.
I I think you're onto it. I think part of it is like part of it, yeah, I want to say is almost like the genre of space itself and science fiction. Um, being a genre where you feel like you the main characters are bringing about the future. And I'm even thinking that for like TV. I haven't watched a ton of like sci-fi movies or TV or whatever, but I did read The Expanse and I did watch a couple episodes, and I think it's like I think spec fic tends to be a little bit like the protagonist will change the world if um yeah. But I don't want to delve too deep into that because I do want to talk more about like coming at it from a tradition of gameplay. I think so because I think one of the things that this game is doing that could be very interesting for someone who doesn't have a lot of games in their background is something that we've talked about, which is like the framing of exploration in the world as an aesthetic exploration. It's all about these fragmented experiences. Like it'll be like, oh, you see some refugees from, you know, insert proper noun, and it doesn't necessarily, like, it's such a short snippet, you know, it's not really doing anything for you, but part of it is there to I don't know, like there is something about the discovery of it, and the way the little pieces assemble into something greater, that I think is like kind of counter traditions of gameplay. Where like what you're saying is like, you know, butting into people's lives, butting into their conversations, like a lot of things in those games are useful to you or pliable to you. They're manipulable by you. And kind of everything has to be, at least in the logic of that game. Like I do remember there was some instance in Mass Effect, there's some quest that like I didn't know what moral choice I wanted to make, or I didn't want to take a side or something. I just didn't want to complete it. But I knew that if I didn't, there'd be less content for me to experience in the game. And I want to experience content. That's what I'm there for. So it forces you to interact with everything, whereas this is very, like you said, even the writing style is pulled back. It's almost like you're witnessing. You're hitting explore and you're witnessing. And I think that there's something there that someone who isn't looking for that gamey element could really feel.
Yeah, I agree, and I love the thing that you said about it being sort of like an aesthetic experience. I think that one this is another sort of like game idea thing. I think one way of getting people who have played enough games to experience that in the way that I think, as you're sort of saying, maybe some people who have not played a lot of games would more naturally just sort of be like, oh, this is just like a vibe. Like I'm just exploring places. It's fine. One way to get me to do that, or at least to like hint that that's a way to be experiencing this game and don't worry so much about solving puzzles or whatever, is I wish if this game let you do essentially like snapshots where like when you read a description, you just click it and save it to your log. So you know, like the equivalent of like in a game like Zelda, like some Zelda games will have like a camera, and you can just like take a photo of your favorite. Actually, the only game I've not played a lot of the newer Zelda games. The only game I can think of that actually does that is Wind Waker. Um, but like that kind of thing where you're like, oh, I can save like the scenes that I think are the most interesting, and that's just like its own reward. And even if I don't do that myself, it lets me know that the game is concerned with that, and then I feel like that would sort of hint to me like don't like overly worry about all the stuff that I am like inclined to worry about. Um, just explore, because I feel like this game is kind of that. It's like just explore the world or the universe. Um, yeah, I
Yeah.
don't know. Like I think there's a lot of ways to approach it, but I feel like that feels like the thing that aligns the most with what the game's already doing in many ways.
I think you're entirely right. Um, yeah, it's funny because like, yeah, it does have like a log, but because it's purely chronological, it actually kind of gives me more anxiety because I'm worried that
Yeah.
the important log entries will disappear. And actually, the second time I played this game through this playthrough, I took notes on like a separate device. Be like, okay, I got this here, I got that there. If I want to go back, I can get that there. But
Yeah, well, so one of the things that the log feels different to me because I've only ever used it to try to troubleshoot essentially. Like I've died more than once and been like, what even happened? And then I go into the log and look and I'm like, oh. Um, so right now I feel like the log it feels actually like the only functional like purely functional non aesthetic or narrative or whatever thing that you can click on other than the option menu. Like it doesn't feel like it's a part of um the like world or whatever. And
Yeah.
I guess what I kind of want is for it to be diegetic or whatever. And the moment that it's diegetic, that gives me a sense of what your character's doing. Because I mean, that's another thing is that like you're just floating around because you click on things, and that's what happens when you click on them. Um, but if I have a sense that my character is keeping track of things, then I'm like, oh, that's what I'm doing. I'm a explorer or a scientist or a person on vacation. Like I'm doing something that involves uh, just experiencing things,
Mm-hmm.
which I feel like is what the like I said, it feels like that's what the game is doing. On one hand, and yet on the other, it feels like it's in tension with what I expect it to be. Especially because the game
Yeah.
begins with that mission that I think you still have, um, of like going to Venus and looking at the animal. At least my game, the last one I played, that was the first mission I had. Maybe it's not
Yes.
always the case.
It was, yeah.
Um, but like since it gives you a mission, I'm like, okay, uh, I'm gonna go do that then. But I don't know why I'm doing it.
Yeah. It also, yeah, so what I was trying to do this time around, the first time around, I see my mission. I'm like, yeah, let me go do it. I do it. It's like, you don't know much about this, so you take notes. And I get a skill animal handling. And then it's like, no missions. And I'm like, oh, okay. Wait for the next mission. I completed. Peter's out. And so that got me wondering if there's something I could have done, if there's some skill I could have brought into it that would have helped me decipher more. So that's why I still have the mission currently. I'm trying to gather things. I'm like, maybe I can get the animal handling skill, head over, and then I'll do the mission better or I'll find out more. It almost, yeah, it it made my mind go to the game because I like the gamey aspect because I was like I wanted to experience more there and I didn't quite get it.
Yeah, I think one of the things that some games do, or all games do to some degree, is just like giving you a sense of like what the bounds of the game are, and in this game, you're never really sure what they are. That like the game will sort of be like, that's you like well, like the most direct way of doing this is when a game like gives you a rating where it's like you got 5 stars, you did that as good as you could do, and that lets you know you to move on. But there's all kinds of like less gamey way, like the way that people speak or the way that like the journal fills out or whatever that sort of like indicate to you what it is that you could have done different so that you can decide whether you're going to do that going forward. But in this game, you never have a sense of that, and so like everything that you're doing might be pointless, or it might unlock a totally new thing, and there's just like no way of knowing.
Mm-hmm.
I've like framed all this as sort of like negative for all these different in all these different ways. One thing that actually sort of cool about that is that's very close to the way that video games were for a very short amount of time in the history of video games. In some ways, so like up until like the '90s, um, the internet either didn't exist or was not accessible by everybody in the way that it is now. And so when you explored games, like when you explored like the first Zelda game or just any whatever game, that was like an adventure game, you actually had no idea how much of that game you had experienced. Those games back then didn't have percentages of completion, and you just didn't know if there could be like a whole nother continent in the game, and you would have no idea unless you like talk to your friends about it. And there's like a way that this game approaches that in a way that could be kind of cool, or kind of is cool in one sense. That because it doesn't tell you, because it tells you so little in the beginning and doesn't directly answer any of your questions, it does encourage you to explore things in a way that like no game works anymore. Because now when I'm playing Baldur's Gate 3, the moment that I'm confused about something like that, I just Google it and I'm like, oh, okay, I did it right. Or there is no more to this romance or whatever. And this game just doesn't work that way. And I don't know, there's something kind of interesting about that.
Yeah, that reminds me of like, slightly older games than, so like contemporary games are like, yeah, you collected 5 out of 5 secrets. And then slightly older games have secrets they don't tell you that they're secrets, that they're there, and you search for that, and that's like part of the fun is like finding these weird solutions and talking to people about it. But yeah, everything now is very defined. And I do think it's really interesting the way that they don't define things. I think in some ways it's really effective, in some ways it's anxiety inducing. I think there are many aspects of the game that are kind of anxiety inducing, which is interesting. Um, yeah, I think one thing it does really well is, yeah, everyone who I've interfaced with who's played this game wants to believe the fiction of the game. They want to live in the world, or like give themselves to the world. Like even the reviewer I was talking about, the reason they didn't want to hit explore is because they didn't want to shatter the feeling of the game being deep and the world having a lot to give them. So it does that very well. And there's something about the way that the game doesn't tell you the bounds of the game that like, in the case of this reviewer was initially conducive to that, but then ended up giving them that worry. I wonder if like for these kinds of narrative games, is it better to just state its boundaries outright? Because that'll get rid of the anxiety, but then if you do that, it also gets rid of like the wonder.
Yeah, I think another option, and this is like my favorite way of designing things, both games and like poems. When I do like visual poems, is when possible to sort of have the thing feel like it breaks far enough away from the tradition of what you're expecting that you then have to have new expectations. Like I think one of the reasons that the anxiety inducing thing is happening to us is that the game has made choices that are very they reflect very traditional game design choices. So like this is a game where you can die and where you can recover from checkpoints, right? Like they're not called checkpoints, but that's what they are. Like that you like go to like there's a few different locations and you can like upload your consciousness into them. And I feel like the moment that you like make that kind of reference for people who have played games, that implies all these other things about what that game wants you to do and what is possible in the game and what you should be thinking about. because like the nature of a checkpoint is is progression. Like now you can take some more risks because if you take a setback, you'll fall back to this point. Um, and if the game was like designed so that it didn't have a checkpoint at all, or that you couldn't die at all, maybe our anxieties would be changed to different anxieties. But I do think um, some of the things I'm worried about when I'm playing the game they wouldn't cross my mind because the game would be just a different thing. It would like be part of a different genre of experience.
Yeah.
Have you ever played Myst?
No.
I recently beat that game. I had the game as a child, um, and felt like I played that game for hours and explored this giant world. And I played it as an adult, and it was so much easier. And I realized I literally solved not a single puzzle as a child. I thought I was like figuring stuff out, but I didn't understand that game at all when I was little. But in some ways, that game is a lot like this game. And in that game, you can't really die, and it becomes obvious very quickly that you can't really die. And so that's like not an anxiety. Uh, Nothing. You don't have anxieties in that game. It feels very much like not really. Like there are puzzles, but like you have all the time in the world to solve them. And that's all through like aesthetic choices that game made, in which you're also exploring all these different worlds and just like looking around, uh, and so on. I won't talk any more about it because you haven't played it, but like I do think there are ways to sort of hint that um, or hint at the way that the game should be experienced by like not giving the markers of these other kinds of experiences. That makes sense.
Yeah. I think what you're saying makes total sense. Yeah. What I'm wondering now is like, is there a way in which the anxiety is productive to what the game is trying to do? Because if thinking back to the one of the designer's statement, it's like sometimes things just happen to you. It feels like it's almost trying to simulate um life, for lack of a better word. It's trying to simulate like I think it's trying to simulate the indifference of a large universe. And
Yeah,
and maybe the anxiety is productive there?
yeah, it's super interesting. That's a really good question. Or even if it's not productive, what would make it what's stopping it from being productive? Because I'm like suggesting like do away with it. Um, but you could also lean into it, like whether or not it like is successful at it. At the moment, it could be like that's the point, is you're supposed to feel some amount of anxiety. Um, but like how would it how yeah, how does that work then? I don't know. That's really interesting.
That'd
Um,
be an interesting take on the horror genre. Not so much like
yeah.
scary things, but just anxiety.
I think one of the things, like I'm trying to think through it, like game design wise. Um, one of the things working against that at the moment is that there aren't the consequences that happen from you dying are that you lose your tools and your body, things that you've collected. Um, and so I think that frames what failure is in this game, or what it
Mm.
feels like. And like so I don't know. I think the answer sort of begins with that, like whether that exists in this universe or not. Um, yeah, I don't
Either.
know. Oh, actually, one thing. Now I just remembered it, and this has a whole lot to do with that question. Uh, is one of the things that I was going to ask you what you thought about was like this game feels like it's based partially on like a press your luck style
Mm.
dynamic,
Mm-hmm.
But because I don't know what luck I'm pressing, I never actually am able to do that.
Yeah.
Um, and so that might also be part of the answer. Like if I knew more about the choices that I was making, then that actually raises the anxiety potentially, right? Like if I'm like, oh,
Mm.
I've gone like 10 turns without saving, and that's like usually a bad idea. But I actually don't know if that's true the way that I'm playing it right now. I'm like, it
Right.
feels totally random. And so maybe if it was like more um explicit about like when you're pressing your luck, when you're like going to potentially lose everything,
Mm-hmm.
like if some planets were more dangerous and they were marked, or it or if there's a number in the corner that says how long it is since you've died, even that is like anxiety
Yeah.
inducing, but like potentially productive. That you're like, oh man, I've never gotten to 40 before.
Mm-hmm.
That means I'm up for a death or whatever. I don't know. What do you think about any of that?
Yeah.
Just like rambling.
Yeah, that does remind me of that one incident I had on like that asteroid that I mentioned earlier. It's like a shady place as I'm hitting explore. I'm realizing that, and then um oh, I'm not near anything. And then it's like my character gets kind of like bruised up, and then I'm like, okay, I'm noping out. But that was like a sort of very subtle indicator of risk and pushing your luck.
Yeah.
And it felt like nice. I think because it gave me anxiety about my character, but it reduced my anxiety about the uncertainty of what's happening. And it was a sort of
Yeah, there could be more like well, actually that text that just popped up is another thing I wanted to ask you about. Was the use of not just that it uses Chinese characters, but that this is the only instance in the game that I'm aware of that even references culture at all.
mm-hmm.
Or at least like real culture. Because I guess like Venetians exist or something, but you don't really have a sense of like everything's sort of like almost like architectural in this world. Like there's just lots of like structures and
Mm-hmm.
references to companies and things. But this is like, oh, there's like more than one language that exists.
I really love this part. I got a short story published last year in October where it's actually kind of sci-fi themed. It's a person whose father is a cyborg, and it's kind of about like generational differences and how to care for somebody that you kind of fundamentally don't understand. And there's a
Hmm.
section, I don't think it was my best short story ever, so I haven't told anybody about it. I like I've sent links to no one.
Yeah,
But
sure.
oh god, yeah, I guess I should. I should get over the embarrassment. But one section I wanted to include was the section in the middle where the cyborg father is talking to their adult child, and I just wrote the entire section in Mandarin. And when I was asking people to read it and give feedback, a lot of them were like, maybe you should translate this part. And I was very much like, no. It's like very important that it's not really comprehensible, because that's like part of what this story is about. It's about not understanding the people that you care deeply about. And it was important for me that some readers feel alienated. Um,
Hmm.
so
Yeah.
yeah, I like that they did that here. I like that I think it is alienating to see characters that are so different that if you didn't know anything about the Chinese language, you would not know how to pronounce this at all. You like your brain doesn't even have a beginning to latch onto, as opposed to some sort of like Romanized or Roman alphabet language. Um, I think it partially serves the function of like making the world feel again very big and messy and hard to package. It's also interesting because I don't know exactly when this game was made, but I think in our present moment, there's a lot of anxiety that the US has about China, specifically as an economic entity. And so I always just love seeing depictions of Chinese entities in space and like how they're like still kind of like big and like technological and competing. I love it. I'm just like, yeah, take that. Be anxious in the future about China.
Well,